You kid, you're a real horse's ass.
Luther said I could learn something from you.
At 89, Robert Redford sits beneath the pale light of a camera that feels almost too intimate. His hands rest on his knees, the same hands that once gripped steering wheels, held scripts, built Sundance. The room is silent, except for the faint hum of recording equipment and the wind outside the Utah mountains. He exhales slow, deliberate before speaking a sentence that no one expected him to say. There are some things I never said about Paul. For decades, the world has built its own mythology around them, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. The Sting, the golden duo who embodied everything America wanted to believe about loyalty, charm, and brotherhood. Their laughter, their timing, their effortless symmetry on screen, it was as if one man's thought completed the other's. To audiences, they were friendship made cinematic. To Hollywood, they were box office alchemy. But to those who watched more closely, there was something else, something that never quite fit inside the word friendship. In the quiet of his final years, Redford's eyes hold the weight of time and secrecy. He does not confess, he remembers. And in his remembering, the boundaries between admiration, love, and survival begin to blur. The words are cautious, tender, but unmistakably real. After half a century of silence, he finally names the space that existed between them, a space filled not with scandal, but with longing, care, and the kind of intimacy that refused to announce itself. The camera lingers. Outside, the snow keeps falling indifferent, eternal, as though the world hasn't realized that one of its oldest myths has just cracked open for a generation raised on their films. This single moment feels like the unmasking of an era. The man who symbolized stoic masculinity now admits there was something deeper, quieter, maybe even forbidden, beneath the perfect frame. Reporters will write headlines. Fans will argue online. Historians will weigh words against context, decades against decorum. But behind all of that noise, something profoundly human happens. Two men who spent their lives being icons finally become people fallible, fragile, and searching for words big enough to hold what they were to each other. The shock is not in what he reveals. It's in the realization that the truth had always been there, hidden in the pauses between interviews, the warmth of shared laughter, the way Paul once said, "I just feel better when he's around." Maybe everyone had seen it. Maybe no one dared to name it. Now, the question rises like breath in cold air. What was it, really, that bound them so tightly? Friendship, love, or something nameless that existed only in the silence between the two? And why did it take a lifetime and the slow approach of mortality for Robert Redford to finally let that silence speak? In the golden haze of the late 1960 seconds, Hollywood was still a dream factory that built gods out of men. Robert Redford and Paul Newman were its twin miracles, the faces of a new masculinity, unthreatening yet magnetic, rebellious yet safe. They were the kind of men who made everyone in the room straighten their posture. When they laughed together, the world laughed with them. When they shared a screen, the air seemed to hum with something electric and unspoken. Their partnership began with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, a film that turned an outlaw story into an anthem of charm. The chemistry was instantaneous, not the kind that could be rehearsed, but the rare kind that makes the camera fall in love. On screen, they traded jokes, bullets, and silent glances that said more than any line of dialogue could. Off screen, that chemistry followed them everywhere. Producers noticed it. Journalists adored it. Audiences demanded more. And so began a myth, the inseparable brothers of American cinema. The illusion was perfect, crafted with care, rehearsed with smiles. Paul, with his ocean blue eyes and philanthropic grace, was the gentleman rebel, Robert. The blonde stoic from the mountains was the silent thinker. Together, they were the dream America wanted to believe in, two men loyal to each other, untouched by ego, living proof that fame could coexist with decency. Magazines called them the last real men of Hollywood. Women adored them, men envied their ease. In interviews, their humor was a dance. One would begin, the other would finish the sentence. "Who's the better looking one?" a journalist once asked. Paul smiled. "He is." Robert shot back. "He's lying." Laughter followed. Cameras flashed, and the myth deepened. But behind the teasing, there was something neither could explain, an unspoken current that made even casual banter shimmer with sincerity. They shared hotel corridors, late-night drives, long silences. They knew each other's rhythms, fears, and contradictions. And yet, they never named it. In the world they lived in, there was no vocabulary for tenderness between men unless it was disguised as brotherhood. Hollywood, of course, thrived on that illusion. The buddy dynamic was profitable. It made audiences feel safe, closeness without risk, intimacy without discomfort. And so, their public image became a contract, Redford and Newman, the perfect duo, icons of masculine harmony. The more the world adored them, the less space there was for ambiguity. It wasn't just their looks or fame that held attention, it was the emotional balance they projected. Paul was sunlight, extroverted warmth, the kind of man who filled a room. Robert was shadow, quiet reflection, a storm held behind steady eyes. Together, they created the equilibrium of cinemas, great dualities, Apollo and Dionysus, logic and instinct, order and chaos. Even their differences felt designed, as if destiny had cast them to complement one another. Still, the illusion came with rules. They never spoke of personal matters in interviews. They never appeared too vulnerable together. They never risked giving the press anything that could be misread. It was an era when privacy was not protection, it was survival. Paul once joked, "If people knew how much we argue, they'd think we were married." The audience laughed. The host laughed. Robert smiled, but his eyes flickered with something quieter. Because in that joke, there was a truth too sharp to name. The illusion extended to their personal lives. Both married, both fathers, both pillars of American virtue. Their wives attended premieres, their children posed for press photos. To the public, their lives were complete. But in private, letters, phone calls, and visits suggested an emotional gravity that went beyond the ordinary. Redford once said in an interview years later, "We didn't need to talk much. We understood each other better than anyone else." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The sentence itself was a wound carefully bandaged in understatement. Their friendship became Hollywood's most beloved legend, an emblem of loyalty and moral strength. No scandal, no betrayal, no rivalry. Just two men who refused to compete, who built each other up in an industry that thrived on comparison. The myth was clean, timeless, sellable. But myths, no matter how beautiful, are prisons made of applause. As years passed, the illusion began to weigh heavier. The camera aged with them. The laughter became rarer, softer. Newman's activism deepened. Redford withdrew into nature and silence. Yet through decades of success, marriages, and loss, one truth never changed. They were still bound by something that neither the industry nor the decades could name. Every photo of them together carried a trace of that secret, a hand on a shoulder, a shared glance, a momentary tenderness that slipped past the guardrails of performance. Hollywood saw brotherhood, maybe it was easier that way. Maybe it had to be. Because if they had called it by another name, one the world wasn't ready to hear, everything might have fallen apart. And so they kept the illusion alive, not out of deceit, but out of devotion. A devotion to each other, to their craft, and to the fragile world that allowed them to exist only as long as they stayed silent. The applause never stopped. The films became immortal. And yet, behind every photograph, there lingered the faint, haunting trace of two men who could never be fully themselves except in the reflection of the other's eyes. There is a kind of love that survives precisely because it is never spoken aloud. Between Robert Redford and Paul Newman, that silence was both sanctuary and prison. For years, their bond existed in the soft spaces between scenes, a touch too brief to be noticed. A shared glance that lingered longer than the script required. Crew members would later describe an unusual quiet between takes, a rhythm of understanding that needed no dialogue. One would walk away, the other would follow. It wasn't rehearsed. It was gravitational. They built that gravity carefully, as if aware that the world they inhabited had no tolerance for ambiguity. It was the late 1960 seconds, the golden age of rebellion, but not yet of permission. The counterculture had reshaped music, art, and politics, but not the vocabulary of male affection. Hollywood could celebrate friendship, but never intimacy between men. And so, they wore their connection under a mask so refined it became a masterpiece of control. Redford once said, "Paul made me better." Newman replied, "He's the brother I never had." But those words, meant to protect, only deepen the mystery. Because what does one call a bond that exceeds brotherhood, yet dares not be called love? Their private correspondence was scarce, perhaps deliberately so. Both men were meticulous about privacy, but fragments remain. Notes scribbled on the edges of scripts, birthday cards, handwritten memos passed through assistants. None of them reveal anything scandalous. Yet together they reveal something unmistakable, a language of affection disguised as humor. "Miss you. Old kid." Newman once wrote after the sting, "Don't get too civilized." Redford replied, short, coded, ordinary, and yet beneath those words, the kind of tenderness only two people truly attuned to each other would understand. When Butch Cassidy rapped, Newman bought Redford a gold watch. On the back, he had it engraved with a single line, not bad for a kid from Utah. It was a joke, but also a message. "I see you. I know where you came from. You belong here with me." Redford kept that watch for the rest of his life. He once said in an interview decades later, "I still wear it sometimes. It reminds me of how rare real connection is." He didn't say whose gift it was. He didn't have to. Friends noticed their quiet rituals. Newman would visit Sundance unannounced. They'd spend days talking about film, politics, and sometimes nothing at all. They would walk in silence through the pines. Redford's dogs trotting ahead. Sometimes Newman brought wine, sometimes he just brought himself. They argued. They teased. They disappeared into that private country only they understood. It wasn't the kind of secrecy that hides shame, it was the kind that protects meaning. In a world obsessed with explanation, their refusal to explain became an act of loyalty. Still, such restraint carries a cost. Both men had families, responsibilities, legacies that demanded perfection. And within those perfect frames, there was little room for ambiguity. Their wives understood or tried to. Joanne Woodward, Newman's wife, once said in an interview, "Paul's closest relationship outside our marriage was probably with Bob. I think they loved each other." The interviewer laughed. She didn't dollars. It was the closest anyone ever came to naming it. The more famous they became, the more fragile their silence grew. They couldn't risk misinterpretation. The press, always hungry for headlines, might have devoured something so sacred. So they built distance. When Newman began to slow down, Redford retreated further into solitude, founding Sundance, disappearing into the mountains. But whenever they reappeared together at a charity event, a retrospective, an award ceremony, the old light returned. One look, one smile, and decades of unspoken truth seemed to glow between them. Perhaps that was their truest communication, the gaze that finished what words couldn't start. For some, that might have been enough. For others, it might have been torment. Psychologists often say that suppression is a kind of survival, a way to keep what we love from breaking under the weight of exposure. Redford and Newman mastered that art. They were men raised in an era that taught restraint as virtue. They were taught to act, to lead, to endure but never to confess. The very qualities that made them icons also made honesty impossible. And yet, within that impossibility, they built a love story unlike any other one, defined not by possession but by presence. Newman once said in an old interview, "I don't think I've ever been bored a day in my life when Bob's around." To anyone else, it sounded like banter. To those who listened carefully, it was the closest he ever came to saying, "I need him." When Newman's health began to fail, Redford visited quietly, avoiding the press. He brought old film stills, sometimes books, sometimes just silence. There's a photo from those final years, Redford's hand resting on Paul's shoulder, eyes meeting for what feels like the last time. It's not an image of actors. It's an image of two men who have carried something unspoken for half a century and finally understand that time will say what they never could. That photograph would later hang in Redford's study. Beneath it, a quote framed on the wall, "Some loves don't need a name." The world never asked what that meant. Maybe because deep down, it already knew. The hidden truth was not scandal, not betrayal, but devotion. A devotion so quiet that it outlasted gossip, outlived fame, and survived every silence. Because in a place like Hollywood, where every secret eventually becomes spectacle, the greatest act of love may simply be to keep one's truth untouched, invisible, and real. It happened quietly, the way truths often do. There was no press conference, no official statement, no scandal. Just an old man in a small chair at Sundance, speaking softly about the past and about the only person he never really left behind. When Robert Redford was asked, almost casually, what he missed most about Hollywood, he paused. He looked down, smiled faintly, and said, "Paul." The interviewer chuckled, waiting for another joke, another Hollywood anecdote. But Redford didn't laugh. He just nodded and added, "You know, I think I loved him more than I knew how to say." And that was it. A sentence that cracked half a century of silence. The moment didn't make headlines immediately. It was too quiet, too human. But for those who knew their story or thought they did, the meaning was unmistakable. The greatest partnership in Hollywood history had never been just about film. It had been about love, in its purest, most unspoken form. For days afterward, journalists dissected the clip. Fans debated online. Some dismissed it as sentimentality, others called it an accidental confession. A few simply called it what it was, closure. But for Redford, it wasn't about revelation. It was about release. He was not rewriting history, he was finally speaking it in full. The man who had built his life around silence had, at last, allowed a single sentence to break through the frost. And that sentence changed everything. For decades, both men had protected each other's dignity not out of fear, but out of love. They understood that the world could turn tenderness into ammunition, they knew the cost of being misunderstood. And so they created a code between them, a language that no one else could read. A glance across a room, a letter that said nothing and everything, a watch engraved with humor, hiding devotion. Now, in his 89th year, Redford's body had grown fragile, but his truth had grown fearless. He wasn't confessing. He was remembering, and in remembering, he was finally forgiving himself for all the years spent pretending that friendship was a sufficient word. He spoke about how Newman used to calm him down before interviews, how their arguments always ended in laughter, how he could never direct a film without hearing Paul's voice in his head. He called him a compass, a man who could keep him from losing his way when fame or politics became too heavy. There was no shame in his voice, no hesitation, only the kind of warmth that comes when you finally accepted that love doesn't always need to be justified. The people listening felt it, that quiet ache of recognition, that soft rebellion of truth spoken too late. Hollywood, however, didn't know how to handle the honesty. Some outlets twisted it into an unexpected confession. Others politely ignored it. A few writers, though, understood the deeper story. They wrote that Redford's words were not about scandal, but about grief, the grief of a man who had outlived his other half and could no longer carry the silence alone. In that sense, his revelation wasn't a breaking point. It was a homecoming. After all the decades of control, of playing roles, the stoic hero, the golden American man, he finally allowed himself to be human. And it moved people, because it wasn't about sexuality or secrets. It was about the pain of unexpressed love, about how two people can shape each other's souls so completely that words become irrelevant. And yet, absence still hurts. In later interviews, Redford would be asked again and again what made their connection so strong. He always smiled and said, "Trust. It's all about trust." But this time, his voice trembled slightly when he added, "I trusted him with my life." No one in the room said a word. They didn't need to. Outside, the mountains stood silent, the snow still falling as if time itself had stopped to listen. In that moment, you could almost hear the echo of Newman's laugh, the flicker of his blue eyes, the ghost of two men still finishing each other's sentences. Perhaps that is what love becomes when it has nowhere left to hide memory. Not something that fades, but something that endures, reshaping the space it leaves behind. When Redford finally walked away from the interview, he didn't look back at the camera. He touched the old watch on his wrist, the one Paul gave him half a century ago, and smiled. It was as if he knew that, this time, the truth would stay. Not the Hollywood truth, not the myth, just the human one. For the first time in his life, Robert Redford was no longer acting. And in that stillness, after decades of applause and denial, he finally understood that love, whatever form it takes, is never a threat to a legacy. It is the legacy. In the years after that quiet confession, the world began to look at their story differently. Not as gossip, not as a hidden romance, but as something deeper, a meditation on the human cost of silence, and the courage it takes to speak when the world has already written your ending. Robert Redford never said more than that one sentence. He didn't need to, because sometimes a single truth whispered at the right time is louder than a lifetime of applause. The shockwaves it sent were not destructive, they were healing. Film critics revisited Butch Cassidy and The Sting, searching for subtext they had missed. Younger audiences, raised in a world more fluent in emotion, saw their connection as a story of devotion unbound by labels. And, for the first time, Hollywood allowed itself to admit what it had long denied, that love, in all its forms, is the invisible current beneath every great story. But Redford's real audience wasn't the press or the fans. It was the memory of one man. He often said, in his final interviews, that he talked to Paul sometimes, not aloud, but inwardly, like a prayer. I still hear him laughing. He confessed once. It's strange. The silence doesn't feel empty anymore. He had carried that silence for more than 50 years. It had been his armor, his loyalty, and his punishment. But now, in the twilight of his life, it became something softer, a place of peace. For all the decades of restraint, what remains are not the words unsaid, but the gestures remembered, the laughter that outlived pain, the loyalty that survived distance, the quiet knowledge that love need not always be declared to be real. In the end, what defined them was not secrecy, but devotion, devotion to art, to dignity, and to each other. And that, perhaps, is the final paradox. Their silence was both the tragedy and the proof of their love. Because love, when it's true, doesn't always demand recognition. It asks for understanding. And sometimes, that understanding arrives too late when the world has softened, when the noise has faded, when all that remains is memory and the echo of laughter through the pines. Today, their films remain timeless, not because they entertained, but because they carried something honest inside their illusion. Watch them again, the smiles that linger, the pauses too long for comedy, and you'll see it, the hidden tenderness that history tried to bury but could never erase. Perhaps that is what Redford meant to say all along, that some truths aren't meant to change the world. They're meant to set one person free. As he once put it, in his final words about Paul Newman, I think we live the same story. We just never said its name. And maybe that is the most human story of all. That two men, in an era that feared vulnerability, managed to build something enduring out of silence and call it friendship. Because love would have been too dangerous a word. But history, mercifully, has better language now. And in that language, the world can finally say what they could not. Not scandal. Not confession. Simply this. They loved each other, and it was beautiful.